Speaker, I'm very pleased to take a call on the third reading of the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Bill. I've followed this bill with some interest, even though I wasn't on the select committee. And that's because I think, like most Kiwis and most people that live in this land, we believe that heritage is about our collective cultural memory. And it's important to us all, and it affects us all in different ways. And so it's been interesting to hear the contributions from the Select Committee, and overall I think they did quite a good job from what I can see. I understand the concerns about the local committees being abolished. I can understand that because I've certainly been involved with local committees who've worked very hard to try and save something that they see as part of their heritage, whether it be in a small town or a suburb. And so on, and I hope that this bill doesn't mean that we will see the end of that kind of organisation where people gather and rally round to mark something that actually means something to them, their history, their ancestors, whānau and so on. The only criticism I have of the Select Committee was that it was introduced before the 2011 election. So it's quite taken some time, and it's good to see it back in the House. And some listeners may be wondering why we're doing this, the day or 2 days before the budget, and why it's so important. And so I thought I'd just try and expand a little bit about what the bill does and what it actually means to the places that I know in Auckland, where I live. Now, the purpose of the bill is to promote the identification, protection, preservation and conservation of the historical and cultural heritage of New Zealand. So I went looking for what that actually means. We've all been aware of battles over buildings and, seen the destruction of buildings and the sad state of affairs in Christchurch when so many heritage buildings have been lost and things torn down when they shouldn't have been. But the places that I know in Auckland, and there's quite a long list of New Zealand Historic Places Trust Category 1 listings in the Auckland region, and other people I'm sure can follow and look around and see what there is in their region. I have to say there's a large number of churches, and I suppose that's to do with our colonial history when people, Pākehā people came to New Zealand and decided that they had to have churches everywhere and try and convert the natives. And some of them are indeed very, very beautiful. But we're all familiar in Auckland with the Auckland Civic Theatre, for example. That is a magnificent piece of artwork. I always get a thrill going into that theatre. I always remember as a child going in and seeing the Wurlitzer organ that they used to have in there that would come up before the movie started. And it has a great history in our city, not only of movies, but also used to be a dance theatre and a place where people could go to dance and go to balls. But the other ones that I picked out were a place called Kinder House, which is in Parnell. Now, Kinder House was built by one of the early settlers, and it's a stone building, and it's quite beautiful. It's in Parnell Road, but why it's important to me is because it has a lot of artworks and books in it from the period of the time. And Kinder House is also important to me because I have a partner who is an antiquarian book collector. And you wouldn't have known that as well. Sorry, he's also a jazz collector as well, but he's an antiquarian book collector. And he was part of a group called Slightly Foxed, after the famous Roald Searle book, Slightly Foxed but otherwise fine. And this is this group that collected antiquarian books, and they used to meet at Kinder House. Still do, I think, but he's gone on to other things like jazz and music. But it was a wonderful experience, and particularly for my young son, to be in a historic building surrounded by art and books and people who valued books and who put them in the context of heritage in many ways. So Kinder House is special to me, and I also want to mention Alberton, which is also a special place for all of us. A beautiful old building in Auckland, but famous for being the home of suffragettes. So very special, strong women's history, and certainly women that I know in the Labour Party often recollect that history and meet there to celebrate it, particularly around Women's Suffrage Day. But there's also some interesting places, because I mean our heritage isn't just about beautiful buildings. Now the Chelsea Sugar Works, the building that's right across, when you cross the Harbour Bridge, you see this big orange building, old building. That's the Chelsea Sugar Refinery, and that's been there for quite a long time and has a wonderful history, actually, not only of people who perform the work and, you know, who should be celebrated for the work that they do and still actually work there, but there's also a wonderful poem that came out of that from James K. Baxter. And the story is that James K. Baxter went to work at Chelsea Sugar Refinery and got the sack after not being there very long. So he wrote a rather unrefined poem to express his disgruntlement, which if you bear with me, Mr. Speaker, I shall read. I had the job of hosing down the hoik and sludge and grit for the sweet grains of sugar dust that had been lost in it. For all the sugar in the land goes through that dismal dump, and all the drains run through the works into a filthy sump. Isn't it quite wonderful? And that is the copy of that, and it's called The Ballad of the Stone Gut Sugar Works, is actually in the Chelsea Sugar Libraries, in the Birkenhead Library on the North Shore where I work. So there are some wonderful parts of our history and places that we like to visit and play. I'm thinking here of North Head. And if you've never been to North Head in Auckland, Mr. Speaker, I recommend you do, because it is a collection of artefacts from our war history, and I think very, very appropriate in this centenary year, going right back indeed to the 1800s, when we thought there was going to be a Russian invasion. And so there were tunnels built, and remember there was the story about a plane being underneath? There was a plane that was built by one of the very, very early aviators, and it was hidden in one of the tunnels under North Head, and people looked for it and put little things down to see if they could see into it. But what it is now is a place of memories. It's a place to remind us that we have been engaged in many wars in this country, that we have been under threat in the past, not only in the First World War and the Second World War, but it is also a wonderful place to visit. It's right on there's a little old volcano on the tip of Devonport, so it's a wonderful place to walk and play, and I've spent a wonderful time with my children and my family at North Head. I was also interested to see that the Northern Club is a historic place in Auckland. Now, the Northern Club, why does that ring a bell? Why does that ring a bell? Okay, we've had something happen in the Northern Club quite recently, as I recall, and I'm not going to lower the tone of this debate by referring to it, but I found that very interesting that the Northern Club was there as well. There are many other things, other places I could name, Mr. Speaker, but I'm running out of time. But what I want to say is what I said at the beginning. It's not just about buildings that are beautiful and old. It's also about our collective cultural history. And that can be an industrial site. It can be a place where people worked. It can be the waterfront, Auckland waterfront, that has managed to continue to keep the remnants of the work, the fishing boats and the rust and the red of the building in a beautiful way. It can be obviously a beautiful piece of land that means something to us. It can be wahitapu. It can be a battle site from the many, many wars that we saw in the early part of our history. So I'm really pleased to support this bill, and I think it is an important bill, albeit 2 days before the budget. I do think I'm pleased that we're actually getting it through, Mr. Speaker. I take on board the concerns that people have expressed about some of the changes, but I don't believe for a minute that New Zealanders will stop fighting for our history and wanting to remember it and wanting to fight at local level and at national level. And so I'm really pleased to have had the chance to speak on this bill.
Ko Claudette Hauiti.
Ka whakatūria te Pouhere Taonga.